Zarya's been the best ground tank in the game for the last 2 months. But why? Zarya's had the highest pick and win rate in ranked, with her meteoric rise starting at around 2 months ago. But why is it that recently we're not seeing that much of her at top play? And in ranked, how can you actually beat a fully charged Zarya? Well, get ready for a Reaper somehow countering a Pharah, some late fight Zarya carries, and how a never before seen Zarya variation might solve her biggest weakness. Now, because this video is going to be bigger in scale, I'm going to be on some Christopher Nolan type shit and split this video into 3 acts, all with their different pyramids. Each act is going to show a different evolution of Zarya over time, the selfless version of Zarya, the sad version of Zarya, and the selfish version of Zarya. Let's dive in. The first game we'll be looking at is the upset between underdogs Gen G and partner team Virtus Pro, with Gen G spearheading the Selfless Zarya Reaper cast comp. To help break this comp down, with each level getting more complex, we start with the damage. Obviously, this refers to Zarya's main goal, getting charged and living in the mid-fights, but this also refers to the damage of Zarya's teammates. You see, Zarya first saw her rise when hitscans got the HPs nerfed, and when Ram finally had his block bug fixed. Hitscan alternatives like Genji, Tracer or Reaper started coming to the forefront, and it just so happened that Zarya synergizes well with them and also plays well against them because Genji Tracer don't have the damage to punish Zarya, which is why we've seen high damage characters like Bastion being used to counter Zarya. I mean, for crying out loud, we even saw Hog for a bit. Then, when people realized that hitscans are actually still pretty playable, they also realized that Zarya was actually okay with them too. And there isn't a better team to show this comp than Gen G, with Tread bubbling the Reaper in the room to help control it. Kevster dashes out too, and this is the key thing about the comp. Essentially, by bubbling either of your DPS, they can actively push forward, stopping the setup from the enemy team. It's not just to farm energy, in fact that's just a byproduct of bubbling like this. When Tread comes back from spawn, he bubbles Backbone yet again, which allows him to push forward aggressively, so much so that it doesn't just force the Kiri to leave, but it also allows him to catch the Wuyang. Kevster counter-swaps the Pharah, thinking that it's a counter because guys, that only hitscans a Cassidy. But by Gen G being this proactive, Backbone chunks Kevster down heavily with that bubble, just as Zodiel hits the finishing blow. Stay tuned because I'll mention how to actually outplay this as the Pharah. However, Kevster does get its revenge as he hits a great concussion onto the Cassidy, sadly meaning that, combined with some Wuyang spam, which still hits like a truck, Zodiel gets first picked and Tread can't bubble in time. But as Kaneo drops the Kitsune, we get to see another benefit of the Zarya in that she can peel for teammates heavily. This bubble just straight up denies the hazard from landing the finishing blow. Combined with the Kitsune, Tread's able to bubble both the supports in the room, while Kevster gets one of the worst barrages I've ever seen. Bro might not be my GOAT anymore.
No, not you, Seamus. Ah, poo.
Meanwhile, because Tread's able to live, he will just kill everyone, as he does with the Freya, soon catching the Pharah and dropping the Grab 2 to confirm the Wuyang kill as well. I really think the inability of the Freya Pharah to enter the room earlier gave Tread a massive helping hand. I've mentioned this idea as bunkering in past videos, but it's a great tool for survival, reducing the angles you can be attacked from. But what about the Freya ball countercomp? Surely that has to beat Zarya, right? Well, thankfully, this is the second layer of the comp. You see, you probably believe that Zarya is useless into Ball Freya. Ball can easily outmaneuver a Zarya, pretending like she doesn't exist, while Freya's got the damage to force bubbles, all while staying out of beam range. But this is where the cast Reaper come in. Reaper can just walk and TP straight onto the Freya with a bubble, as you can kinda see Backbone just do here. But I've already kinda covered that. The cast specifically can deny the Freya value pretty decently during updraft, so much so that it's forced teams to play Hanzo over the Freya in the cast matchup. something Kajor, Team Liquid's head coach, explained here.
Because the cast can actually get like pretty decent angles on the Freya when she's flying up, we decided to play the Hanzo and ended up working out really good.
And we get a great visual example here too, as Zodiel catches the Kiriko, but soon after killing the Freya as well. Not to mention him dodging the bowler as well. The cherry on top though is that when Freya's value gets limited, Zarya can thrive a lot more because there's no more damage to burn through her. Look at how Tread can just hold carts and 1v2 a ball Tracer despite having no Kiriko because neither character's got the damage to burn through the Zarya. And yes, Tracer does technically have the damage, but that's only up close. Onto the last layer though, which is scaling and beating baits. Scaling just means that over time, the Zarya comp scales very well in power. That is partially down to Zarya becoming more and more of a threat later in the fight, but also more broadly too when it comes to perks. I'm not gonna pretend like that new minor perk she got wasn't hugely impactful in allowing Zarya to stay more of a threat for longer. And while Reaper did get his perks nerfed recently, mainly by having his Shadow Step turn into a major perk, it's still a game changer on short slatline maps. Scaling also applies to ultimates too. The Tracer Freya ults are absolute dogshit, at least in this meta. If Brig Ana was meta again, then Pulse becomes a lot more impactful because Brig Ana can't do shit against it. However, Kiriko can cleanse it sadly. As for Freya's bowler, yes it does charge quickly, but it's a similar case to Pulse. If you're in a Symmetra heavy meta, then yes, Bowler becomes great at punishing TPs, but barring that case, it's hard to imagine Bowler getting much value. While Blossom isn't the best dot on the game, and frankly, neither is High Noon, they are actually something you can plan around. I talked about this in my Zodiel video, but High Noon is really good at disrupting setups, even if it doesn't directly lead to kills. You can see here that Zodiel pops the High Noon, and while it doesn't get a kill, forces the entire enemy team to scatter, allowing the rest of Genji to push forward, with the Lucio just so happening to catch Kevster. As for baiting, I'm just referring to how good Genji are, or were, at forcing plays from the enemy team. In this fight, the ult economy does heavily favour them, but Ice is forced to go for a risky Mines play on points, precisely because of the point pressure from Genji. And while the fight win is fairly expensive, it ends up being a simple grab from Tread, plus a High Noon from Zodiel that secures out the fight win. In this more economical fight, you can see the basic bubble cycle that Tread gives to his Reaper, but looking at Backbone's POV, I think it's just to bait out the Kitsune, which all of Genji successfully kites, but to make matters worse for VP, Zodiel catches Kevster when he tries throwing out a Hail Mary pulse bomb. Again, my goat might be washed. Now, Genji did end up full capping this map against the supposed Countercomp, but once we shift to North America, we get a different look at Zarya, leading me on to the second act. Taking a trip to the land of the free, where the top 7 stocks are more inflated than the average pyrocynical meme, we don't see much Zarya. And when we do see Zarya, they get packed the fuck up. So what's happening? Well, let's start off by talking about Zarya's squishiness, and each level is gonna get less obvious as to why Zarya struggles. Zarya's squishiness isn't a secret. In fact, like I mentioned beforehand, Bastion's been a key player in abusing that. But because now people have realised that hit scans more generally are still pretty good, it puts a dent into how aggressive a Zarya can play. We see that in the first fight here, where the Zarya walks forward to punish the Winston and prevent his staging. Of course, we just saw Genji do this kind of thing but with Reaper, and you can also do the same thing but with yourself. But Hawk continues to walk up, uses his second bubble, and still gets bursted down by the enemy Sojourn. Now sure, maybe he could just strafe to the right side, but I don't think he was expecting to get immediately domed and bursted down. So even though Sugarfree lands the second kill, Infected is back before Hawk is, so SSG needs to retreat. Things still get worse as we get into the idea of baiting bubbles. Very simply, if you can apply just enough pressure without committing to force a Zarya bubble, she becomes a lot more killable. You can see Hawk initially bubbles his Sojourn on the walk, which is possible and fine, but then he turns and bubbles the Winston jump, who's just easily able to drop down and avoid it entirely. Having baited these bubbles, Infected's able to hard commit with his team, meaning Hawk gets cooked harder than that clip of Gym Legacy getting nutmegged. And I know they're hard committing because the Kitsune gets dropped just to ensure the Zarya gets killed. This isn't the first time we've seen this though. In fact, we saw this back in that Gen G game. Apply just enough pressure to bait out a Zarya bubble, then push as hard as you possibly can to just kill the Zarya and her team. But that's just the start of the issues, as we get into the next layer, clearing space. Basically, when Infected controls the high ground, nobody on Zarya's team can really clear him from it. In fact, the Winston team want the Zarya to walk out on the low ground because they can very easily punish it with the beats, which, to nobody's surprise, is exactly what happens. The solution to this is to try and clear the high ground first, which Hawk try and does, but sadly gets booped away. Obviously, if he was on D.Va, this doesn't really become an issue. D.Va is bulkier and has got more consistent mobility, but Team Liquid banned D.Va on this map, which is why they're playing Zarya. Now, you'd think with the Grav, surely the Zarya team can find their footing, but an early primal from Infected means that they can't. And actually, I think he tried to bait out the Grav by primaling in early and pouncing away. The real killer though is that the Kiri gets a bubble from Hawk, meaning that he's only got one bubble left. And while he tries to farm energy, he just gets bursted through by the enemy Sojourn, once again showing how squishy Zarya can really be. Just a few minutes later, we get a repeat of that high ground situation, and it seems that Infected is cleared from the high ground this time around. But this is where we get into the last layer, LOS and distance. The first issue we encounter is where does Hawk go from here? You can't access any of the high grounds, nor can you reach them. He's actually just forced to go back main, while Infected jumps back to the high ground like nothing happens. Things become even worse as Sugarfree tries to make a play coming up to the high ground, but gets heavily marked out by Vega on the Lucio. The issue is that Hawk hasn't got line of sight to bubble Sugarfree in, so the bubble is kind of a waste. Having now forced out the Tracer, this is also a trigger for Infected to jump in, and for RuPaul to push the advantage with Kitsune, doming the enemy Kiriko and eventually cleaning up the Zarya. Now this is kind of a comp issue, because Tracer can't just teleport to the high ground like a Reaper. And not to mention, Winston's bubble can split off a Zarya a lot more compared to a ball pole driver. But that's a boring answer. The real question for Liquid is how do we ensure that bubbles get no value? In other words, how do we make sure those bubbles that we were seeing onto the Reaper, as well as these bubbles onto the Tracer, get no value? And the answer is distance. Look at this bubble from Hawk onto Sugarfree. From Sugarfree's POV, he actually can't connect onto anyone because the Sojourn is playing just enough distance away from the Tracer. Look back at the Kevstafari example where he got prevented by the Bubble Reaper. Had he just played more distance away from the corner, it's impossible for a Bubble Reaper to do anything. I've talked about this idea in my Hog video, where you play just enough distance out of his hook range to where the Hog has to give up the space. And here, you play just enough distance away from the Bubble Tracer or Bubble Reaper to where the Zarya has to give up the space. Now, I know I haven't addressed the elephant in the room, being the rise of Ramattra, but I'm saving that for the next act. Speaking of which, in the EMEA Grand Finals, we saw the man with no hands, TVNT, pull out a less conventional Zarya comp. And while we technically did see this the day before, we haven't seen it against the Sim D.Va comp, leading me onto my first layer of this pyramid, the 3-2 split. Because Twisted Minds are playing the Wuyang instead of the Lucio, the Kiri is actually able to play a lot more closer to the Tracer. This means that TVNT doesn't actually need to bubble the Tracer, and even though he could, he doesn't. He keeps both bubbles selfishly, which allows him to live getting rushed on by 5 people. I find this variation super interesting, because instead of a Reaper drawing aggro with bubble, it's a Tracer Kiri doing the exact same thing. So not only can Zarya live by having 2 bubbles, but there's a Tracer Kiri coming from behind. This is also called pinching or pincering, and clearly, judging by the kill feed, it's working like a charm. Things get more interesting when you realize that everyone on Twisted Minds, barring the Zarya, has high mobility. In other words, there is no other target to rush on. You might say Freja, but if Quartz plays distance, he'll be fine. Freja Wuyang Kiri is something that we've also seen other teams play to beat rush style comps. everybody's got the mobility to avoid getting rushed on, but everyone also has threat from distance too to punish things like sim TP. They can have their cake and eat it too. Back to Lijiang, and we see more constant pinches from the Tracer, this time forcing Suzu and getting a solid clip in, and just straight up killing the Cassidy in the fight after. Again, it's just easy because the Cass has to look at the Zarya, not the Tracer. The Wuyang is the ultimate cherry on top though, not just for getting good splash damage early on, but also you can just pop his Tidal Blast when Zarya runs out of bubbles, which basically makes Zarya impossible to kill. The Kitsune also allows Zarya to get her bubbles back constantly, plus Wuyang's got that burst healing thanks to his wave. There's also the distance management. I've talked about expensive positioning before when it comes to Widowmaker, that even if you die, the enemy team have to put in so many resources to come and kill you that it's worth it. And we see a prime case of that in the last fight. Checkmate invests the sim wall to push onto point safely, and Landon of course gets his Suzu forced because of the sheer spam. The Cass sacrifices his life to try and kill the Zarya, and while the Kiri eventually gets the kill, look at the state of his team. So many resources were burnt to kill the Zarya, which allows Quartz to basically run around free, eventually picking up 3 kills. Ziad tries to fly onto him, but he just updrafts away. And with that, Twisted Minds 100-0 the rounds, and actually force a Zarya mirror for the rest of the series, which they end up winning. But what about Ramattra? Well, this is purely a regional thing. In EU, people think Ram is terrible because you can just kill the Ram.
You just kill him, and it's actually fine, you know? just kill him, it's pretty simple. I think Zarya with the right ban situation, I think can beat it for sure.
But over in America, Kosaurus has talked about Ram being viable in terms of holding space aggressively, and if Ram's viable, Zarya does struggle. She still has her weaknesses on vertical maps against dive teams who know what they're doing, either by pressuring the Zarya to bait bubbles, or just knowing how to avoid Reapers or Tracers that are getting bubbled. In fact, if you watch Tree's POV the entire match, there's not a single time where a bubble Tracer can actually reach him, but a more selfish Zarya variation to at least alleviate that former issue might be the solution. As always, if you enjoyed, be sure to subscribe and click the video on screen too. Until next time.